Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LEC week number 2 overview and analysis video. We are 2/3 of the way through the regular season in the LEC already in the winter split. It's crazy because we've only covered 1 week of any other region on this channel, and we're already 2/3 of the way through the LEC, but that's the quickness that the LEC plays at now with the 3 different splits, with the massive playoffs that they have, and so, I'm excited to get into it, but we've got a lot of stories, a lot of, shakeups going on in the league this week. Not everything went exactly as it did in week number 1, and so there's a lot of interesting things to talk about, but if you guys are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. Of course, you can check out the video on week number 1, as well as my LEC primer up in the iCard right now. That's going to be a pretty useful thing to check out if you want to know my thoughts and opinions going into the week, but obviously, we're going to be going through this in the same way that we go through all of the weekly videos. So if you're not familiar with how we do things here on this channel, we're going to be going game by game, talking about all 15 games that happened over the course of the weekend. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of the week, I'll be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, I will also be updating my power rankings at the end of the week. I'm going to do that at the end of every single week, and so, there are going to be some changes. Spoiler alert, not everything is going to stay the same. It was a pretty wild week, and I think we learned a lot more about some of these teams with some of the schedules getting expanded. Maybe some of these teams having a bit of an easier or a harder schedule than maybe they did in week number 1, so they had to show different things in this week. Some of them stepped up, some of them did not. It's definitely going to be interesting, but again, let me know down in the comment section below what teams you were interested by, what games interested you over the course of this week. Always love to hear from you guys, but without further ado, let's jump right into day number 1 of week number 2 here, when we kicked off day 1 with 2 of the more lifeless teams, at the very least, in the first week of the season. It was Team Vitality taking on Rogue, and Vitality is able to pick up their first win of the season. Really, really big for them. Obviously, you don't want to be 0-4 or 0-5 or anywhere around that, because you just need to be not bottom 2. That's really all you need to be going into the playoffs here, is not bottom 2, and getting a win here in week number 2, at least to start off against a team that you probably should be beating, one of the weaker teams in the league in Rogue, is super important for Vitality. So again, nice win from them. But Rogue is just completely inept. That's the kind of takeaway for me from this game, is that this team is just so slow. They are so inactive. They're the opposite of aggressive. It is just, they're the most passive, boring team I've ever seen play. For those of you who watched the LCS last year in 2023, they remind me a ton of Dignitas last year, just how they played the game, where they didn't really seem to have any sort of playmaker. They didn't really seem to have anybody that wanted to make those plays in the early game to get them snowballing, and so they ended up just losing these slow games, even if, mechanically speaking, they are talented. And that's just kind of what it feels like for Rogue right now. But again, for Vitality, this is a very important win. Player of the game is going to go to VTO. This was not difficult. This Akali was a massive problem for Rogue to deal with as we continued onward in the game. VTO is one of those players that you really want to see break out again. This is a guy who was so dominant on Misfits for so many years, a former MVP in this league, and then he went over to Excel last year, and it just felt like every bit of that ended up falling off. Like, the aggressiveness was gone, the lane dominance was gone. He was just kind of a guy. Even when he got to Heretics, like, he was okay, but he mostly thrived on a lot of off-meta picks that people just weren't as comfortable on. Things like the AP Kai'Sa mid really come to mind for what VTO was playing a lot of in 2023, and you wanted to see him get back to not only playing meta, but dominating on meta picks like we know he has been able to do in the past, and that's kind of what he did here on the Akali. Obviously, if you're going into an Azir who just wants to sit there and lane and be super boring and give over waves because he doesn't want to, step up and contest anything, that's going to make it a lot easier for you to be able to play matchups like that, but you still have to go out and dominate, and man, his mid to late game was also really good. His team fighting was really good on Akali. This definitely felt more like Misfits VTO than it did feel like Excel or Heretics VTO, which is what you need to see. He has the potential to be the best player on this team, maybe outside of Photon, who's also obviously very good, but it's really, really important and really nice to see him carry a game here in week number 2. Again, I know it's not the toughest of competition, but still seeing it, I think, is very, very good. Douglas was really solid, completely out-jungled Marcoon here. I'm still 1 foot in, 1 foot out on Douglas as a player. He certainly wasn't great in week number 1. It definitely looked like his pathing was getting a little bit exposed, as I talked about in that video, but, this was better going into a jungler who is pretty notorious for not being super active in the early game. It's good to see Douglas be able to take advantage of that. Karzi and Hilly, I think, were solid here. Karzi Hilly had a lot of attention dumped into him in the mid game here, but Hilly did a good job of being able to stop a lot of that attention, even with a lot of, prio going into the Sivir on the other side. So good stuff from the bot lane to just survive, which is something they very much were not doing in week number 1. They were candidates for my dud of the week as a whole. Both of them were, and then Photon was the best player on this team in the first week, but he got to take a little bit of a step back in this one, and that's nice for him. So good to see VTO step up and be a primary carry, and hopefully this is a good sign that Vitality has somebody that they can play through, at least for the upcoming games. And then for Rogue on the other side, this team is just so nothing. I've already said it in this segment, but they're so slow, they're so passive, they don't really have a lot going on. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Larson in the mid lane. I know his scoreline doesn't necessarily look as bad as maybe some other players on this team, but at the end of the day, he didn't do anything. He gave up so many waves because the Akali was so aggro, and he was just willing to say, whatever, I'll just be behind a little bit going into late game, which is something that Larson has done in the past. It's something that he's kind of made a career doing, but typically on teams like he has played on, like on the other Rogue and Koi teams that he has played on, somebody on the team is playing super aggro. Typically it was Malrang in the jungle, but he's always had, a winning lane, and he's always been the safety net, the security blanket, I guess, in the back half of the game, where he doesn't have to win early. He's never really going to play super aggro. He's not going to roam too much, but he is going to team fight really well. The problem is that nobody on this team plays well in the early game, so they never actually get to the stage where, Mark Hoon's team fighting and Larson's team fighting actually come into play. Shigenda has not been good this year. He's not been able to win on the top side, although top lane is a very difficult role to win in right now. And Comp and Zoelise have just not been it at all, really. Zoelise has looked okay. He's probably been the best looking player on this team, in my opinion, which is crazy because he is the rookie, but Rogue just doesn't really have anything going for them at the current moment. Again, I compare them a lot to Dignitas from the LCS in 2023, and that was a team that, historically underperformed, especially in the spring split. They almost went, winless throughout the spring split, and so I'm worried about Rogue. This really does feel like one of the bottom 2 teams in the league, and I think with a roster like this, you're a little bit disappointed in that, because I know they didn't have a ton of money going into the year, but still, they were able to put together something of some veterans, in the LEC, and it really just is not working out. Stylistically, they do not work well together, but, again, for Vitality, this is a nice win. It is over Rogue, though. You don't want to panic. You don't want to freak out too much that, oh, they won. That's great. They're back on track. You got to see them do it against teams that are actually good before you start to really, put them in that conversation, but a win over Rogue really makes you think, okay, maybe this isn't a bottom 2 team. Remember, you just need to not be bottom 2. That's all you need to be, and Vitality with this win, I think, puts themselves in a much better position to be that. And then moving on to our second game of day 1 here, and this is a battle between 2 teams near the top of the standings and near the top of the power rankings, especially after week 1. It was SK Gaming taking on Team Heretics. And Heretics is going to pick up the win, moving to 3-1. They are going to hand SK their first loss of the year up until this point, and this is expected. I know this doesn't necessarily feel expected because Heretics had that really rough day number 1 against Mad Lions, but look at the power ranking numbers I have besides these teams. I had Team Heretics staying at number 2 in my power rankings. I think, that game 1 was one of those games where you look at it and, we've all played games like this in solo queue where so much goes wrong so early. When a game is over by like 6 or 7 minutes, then at that point, you're really not judging the quality of the team anymore. You're really just judging how quickly they can end the game, right? And so I wasn't trying to put it on Heretics too much because they looked so good in the back half of the week. And while SK did look strong, I needed to see a lot more from this team before I just crowned them as one of the best teams in the league, even if I do really like their roster and I'm not surprised that they're doing well. But Heretics was better, and they were better by a lot in this game, and that's not particularly surprising to me. They have a lot more going for them in terms of experience, obviously, but in terms of a general strategy, I think their draft was infinitely better here. You can talk about how SK, got a lot of comfort picks, if you will. You got Exakick on Aphelios, you got Niski on Gragas, you got Irrelevant on Rumble. These are a lot of picks, even Isma on Nocturne, right? These are a lot of picks that these players are very comfortable with, but, it's hard to go up against Senna Seraphine right now. It's such a ridiculously strong bot lane, and when Jankos has this much priority early on in the game because you're giving it over, I mean, look at the comp on SK, you're just giving Xin Zhao a ton of priority in this game. When he has that, it's going to be really difficult to beat him, and Jankos is going to get player of the game for this Xin Zhao performance. It's really nice to see him step up. I'm not going to say he was the most underwhelming part of this team in week number 1, but I'm certainly going to say that I wish I would have seen more because he was the player that I think performed the best by far out of anybody on this team last year. He was the one that was coming into the year where you're like, I have no question marks about Jankos. Even when he was on a bad team, he was dominating, and it really felt like, oh, Kaiser looked awesome in week 1, and Wunder was looking pretty solid, and Perks and Flack had looked really good down the stretch. Jankos was just kind of there in week number 1, so it's nice to see him get a lot of prio in the early game here on Xin Zhao and take advantage of the timing weakness that SK had just over the course of this game. Take advantage of the experience that you have available to you. So really nice stuff from Jankos, and very much deserves player of the game, but this was kind of an everyone effort. You could give it to almost anybody, and I would agree Wunder was a lot better in the top lane here on the Udyr. This Udyr's been very difficult to stop, especially for Western teams, and Wunder made that very clear in this one. Perkz was really good in this game. He kind of just, sat there and farmed until he hit this super big power spike and was a great team fighter. In the back half, Flacken and Kaiser got to play Senna Seraphine. I mean, this is what Flacken does at his best. He played so much Seraphine when he was playing with these guys before that I'm really not surprised to see it again here on Heretics. This is a very standard comp for what this team likes to play, and I think they executed on it well. This is exactly, I think, what you were kind of looking for from them. And then for SK, I don't want to freak out. Again, Heretics is genuinely a very good team, and you're not going to worry too much about losing to them. This is a game that you probably should lose. The 3-0 was really great to start the year, but really the only great win in week number 1 was over Fnatic, and that is a great win. That's a really strong win, but their schedule is only going to get harder. This is one of the teams that I think is going to really get tested more as the year goes on and as they start playing tougher teams. And at least in their second, real challenge this season, they weren't able to pass. They kind of got run over in this game. Comfort wasn't necessarily maybe the decision against a team that was going to be a bit more aggressive in the early game, because this draft is very passive. It takes a long time to get online. Gragas doesn't have any prio in the mid lane. Aphelios is certainly not going to have a ton of prio in the bot lane. Nocturne needs to get level 6 before he can truly be a huge impact on the map. And Rumble's more of a teamfight champion anyways, even if he is okay in lane. It just really wasn't a draft that I think gave SK a huge chance to win in this one. Dud of the game could go to basically anybody. I really debated whether or not to give this to Exakick. I really debated on whether or not to give this to Niski, because I think both of them very much deserved it. But I'm going to give it to Irrelevant in the top lane because he was pretty irrelevant in this game. A lot of people are talking about how Rumble is super strong in the meta, and while I agree, I certainly don't think he is unbeatable. And I saw a lot of people last week crowning Irrelevant as a top 1, no question, top laner in the LEC. I just was never on board with that. I said as much in my video last week. I was like, Irrelevant's a very good player. I probably put him too low in my rankings, but top 1, top 2 is still a bit rich for me at this current moment. And I think games like this are a good example of why. He just did not play well on the Rumble. The ultimates were not good. The team fighting was not good. But again, everybody on the team lost, and so it's hard to just blame him. Niski was really bad in the mid lane, doing absolutely nothing on his signature Gragas pick. Exakick was really bad in the bot lane. The positioning coming out of the Aphelios was so passive and so not good. He just let Seraphine scale into the late game, and I get it. A lot of pressure was put there by Xin Zhao, but you got to do something on the map. Somebody here has to play aggressive. Isma has been a super aggressive jungler at the start of his LEC career here. He has been notoriously a level 3 ganker, but this team is just not set up to do that. So while a lot of these champions are comfort picks, I think the style that this team has kind of grown into, or at least the style they showed in week number 1, is basically the opposite of what this team wants to accomplish, and I really just think they put themselves at a pretty big disadvantage because of it. Very boring game, but I think SK is going to be able to bounce back. I think I'm not super worried about their long-term health because of this. I think it does, show some weaknesses, that Heretics is maybe a bit of a tier above them. Maybe SK isn't in that, potential LEC finals tier, but they still have a lot of ways to go before I'm, completely counting them out. This could still be a top 4 team in the league, even with this loss. And then for Heretics, this was a good win. You really need to continue this momentum building because I think a lot of people were scared after day number 1. I think this just continues to show that was a bit more of an outlier than it was the reg, the norm, if you will. Days 2 and 3 of week 1 were really solid. Day 1 here of week number 2 is really solid. This might be a team that fluctuates every so often because players like Perkz and Flacken and Kaiser are pretty volatile, but at least when they're on, I think we know what the good Team Heretics is going to look like at this point. And then moving on to game 3 here of day 1. This is a pretty classic rivalry at this point in the LEC, but these teams do look a bit different, or one of these teams looks very different from how they're used to. It's Mad Lions taking on G2 Esports. And G2 is going to be able to pick up the win. They're going to move to 3-1. They're going to avenge that loss at the end of last week to Rogue that really just shouldn't have happened in the first place. There really isn't a lot of examples as to why that should have happened other than this is what G2 does. They lose to the worst team in the league every single year. It's just kind of who they are. But, they were able to take this one. It certainly wasn't the cleanest game in the entire world. You're kind of sitting there waiting for a couple of these players to actually start showing up for G2, but the players that are playing well are certainly good enough to be able to carry this team across the finish line at the current moment. They are are the best players in the league, in my opinion, at the current moment. And for Mad, while you put up a pretty good fight, the coordination and the macro just wasn't there in this one. And this really goes to show just kind of the difference between a team like G2 that is full of very experienced players that know where they need to be and know what they need to do in order to win a late game that they're not ahead in. And then a Mad Lions team that doesn't know how to capitalize on a gigantic lead that they were able to generate in the early game. So let's talk about a player of the game. No brainer. This one's going to Caps in the mid lane. And I think there's a really strong argument to be made right now that Caps is the very early front runner for MVP in the LEC in the winter split here. Remember, LEC MVP at the very least is a regular season award. And Caps so far, you know, we're almost halfway through the year, and I would say that he's the front runner. So that's something to talk about, but he's just been spectacular for G2. The rest of this team is, you know, I kind of oscillated between being good and bad, and that's not what you would have expected from G2, but Caps has really held it down. I think Mickey has also been relatively fine. He was really bad in that game against Rogue, but you can live with that. I mean, you know, again, they probably just took him for granted. That's really what I would chalk that up to, but Caps has definitely been the star. The Azir here was super influential. His team fighting on that champion is actually insane. I know a lot of people don't necessarily think about Caps as like this late game team fighter, somebody who, you know, can just scale into the late game, not worry about the early game, not be proactive, but he has the skill set to be able to do that if you need him to do that. Certainly didn't, you know, play passive. That's not what I'm trying to say, but the Azir getting into the late game and being able to team fight front to back in the 5v5 is kind of what got G2 this win in the first place. So that's good for them. Like I said, I think Mickey on the Zyra also looked really good here. We're not seeing Zyra a lot in pro play, but I think she does hold a little bit of a niche as this super aggressive, super high damage, you know, AP support. You know, we're seeing a lot of enchanters especially, and, you know, poke mages can really deal with that. You know, people who have really high damage thresholds like Zyra can really deal with that at a much higher level, I think, than, you know, maybe the other engagers that a lot of these other supports are very used to at this point. But I want to give a lot of credit to Yike in this game. I think he doesn't necessarily get a lot of the credit that he deserves on this team. He played really well in this one. He tried his absolute best. There were a lot of circumstances where he was setting up Caps or setting up Mickey to do something really cool, and he would die and they would get all the credit. So I do want to give some credit to Yike because I thought his macro was actually really good in this game. He was always in the right spot. But, you know, there is a big concern on G2, and I don't want to panic. I don't want to freak out, but Hansama is not playing well. Like, he is really, really not playing well. And he was really bad at Worlds for this team as well. His playstyle has always been considered relatively limited. But teams are now just banning out Draven Kalista at the start of every ban phase. And he's having to play actual AD carries, and he's not particularly good at them right now. I'm not saying that that's going to last the entirety of the year, but you take away a lot of these super aggro, super early game 2v2 lane-focused picks that you can just invest a ton of resources into quickly, and, you know, is Hans really that great? You know, I don't know. It's certainly concerning at this point, because individually speaking, he is trying his best to throw some of these games for G2, so I'm not saying that that's going to be a problem throughout the entirety of the year, but it's certainly something on my radar, because, you know, Hans has been somebody that's been on my radar as maybe not being a star. He was the one player on this team that came in with a B, you know, he was a B+ in the offseason grades video. Everybody else was somewhere in the A grade for me for G2, but not Hansama, and so to see him come out and actually kind of be a liability to this team at the start of the year, it's certainly concerning, but right now, Caps and Mickey are good enough for you to be able to win. Broken Blade was fine in this game, certainly wasn't spectacular, but was fine, and Yike, I think, was better than people are going to give him credit for, but generally, I think G2, you know, still has a lot of kinks to iron out and a lot of mistakes, especially in the early game, that they just have not figured out just yet. But for Mad, you love that they were able to get such an early lead against a team like G2. Elyoya was so active in the early game on this Viego. He actually started snowballing a lot quicker than I think anybody would have anticipated in a matchup like this. The problem was that G2 actually had great macro towards the back half of the game. Broken Blade in particular did a great job of pulling Elyoya out of team fights away from Nico into side lanes so that you didn't really have that super fed Viego for a lot of the 4v4s that G2 ended up forcing in the mid game. Maybe in a lot of different circumstances, those plays don't work because of the gold lead that Mad Lions had, but they didn't really have a lot of gold on the people that needed it. I mean, the Nico didn't have a ton of gold. The Ashe didn't have a ton of gold in this game, and so when you got those 3v3s, those 4v4s, where the Azir was just kind of allowed to free hit, and you had the Zyra doing secondary damage, and you had the Vi for full engage, it was actually kind of difficult for Mad to win, and that's why they lost this game. If they had been able to, you know, clump together around objectives and actually fight 5v5, I don't think there's any way G2 actually wins this, or Mad actually loses this, and so you do want to give them credit in that regard. regard because they were able to generate a lead and they were able to get, a pretty strong gold advantage into a team like G2, but you want to see them be able to clean up the second half of the game, and this is just something that I think is going to come with time for a lot of these players. You had Oyoya, who I think had a really good game here, but everybody else really struggled at points. Merwin's going to get my dud of the game on the Gwen. Really didn't feel like she did any damage in this game. Gwen has quote-unquote always been a counterpick to K'Sante. I put that in quotes because as we've seen in Pro over the past year, it's just not necessarily been a practical counterpick. K'Sante just continues to win that matchup because of how strong that champion is, even though Gwen's kit is designed to beat champions like K'Sante. But Merwin had basically no impact in the back half of this game. If you have a Gwen that's diving into the backline, disrupting Azir and Zyra, like that's how you're able to win a game like this. That's how you're able to keep this thing alive. And I thought Merwin just really struggled in the back half of the team fights, but you could say the same thing about Supa. You could say the same thing about Frescoe, who really never got that massive Nico ultimate off in this game. There were just a couple of things that I think if you clean them up, if Mad Lions ends up being a little bit more clinical in the mid game, perhaps we're looking at this as a pretty big win for a 3-1 Mad Lions team. As it stands, they're now 500. They're sitting at 2-2, and that's still relatively fine. I think a lot of people had very low expectations of this team going into the year. I still think that they're one of the more interesting teams in the league. Like I said last week, it feels like a top 6, and Mad Lions feels like they are a part of that, but G2 is just on a little bit of a different level. Caps was the best player in this game, his mechanics were the best in this game, and his aggressiveness was the best in this game, and that's why G2 is walking out with a win. They're going to be happy that they're going to 3-1, but man, it's not in the dominant fashion I think that a lot of people expected out of G2, in the preseason when we saw the rosters. And then moving on to game 4 here of day 1, 2-1 teams that are kind of similar in terms of how they performed in week number 1. It's Fnatic taking on Team BDS, and a really big win here for BDS. This is exactly what this team needed. This is exactly what the doctor ordered, and I think it really does open up some weaknesses in terms of Fnatic. First of all, what is this draft? I mean, some of this draft from Fnatic is just very confusing. I don't hate it in concept, but I hate it in execution because I hate it against BDS in particular. You're blind picking Udyr into Adam. Why? Like, I know you banned Darius, but Olaf is up, and I don't get this. Adam, for his credit, takes his very famous champion that he plays a lot of, that's very good into Udyr, and completely obliterates this game, but Labrav on Blitzcrank looked phenomenal. There's just a lot going right, I think, for BDS right now, and this team has already proven that they're better than a lot of people expected them to be going into the year, that a lot of the, worrying and a lot of the, fear-mongering that people did around, losing Crownie means that this team is going to fall apart. Clearly, that was not the case, and honestly, I probably had them too low in my original power rankings. I manually overrode them lower in my power rankings because I thought there was going to be a bit of a problem because of hearing how, people tended to talk about BDS. I had them in my top 4 originally. Probably should have kept them there, especially with how they look right now. But let's talk about it. Player of the game, no brainer. This one's going to Adam. What a great game from him. You give him one of his Gods champions. Okay, that's fine. It's whatever. There's a lot of them. You can't really ban them out every game. You counterpick yourself by picking Udyr, and one of his Gods champions is a hard counter to Udyr. Very confusing. Very, very suspect. Again, I get that Udyr's been really strong in the LEC, but this does open a can of worms about Oscar that we will get into a little bit later, but awesome stuff from Adam. He has so consistently been so good over the past couple of years. Obviously, his time on Fnatic wasn't necessarily ideal. He still looked pretty good on that roster, and then his first year on BDS, what was it, 2021? That long ago at this point? It was a disaster for him. He goes back down to the ERLs, he goes back down to the LFL, and he actually looks fantastic there, gets called back up last year, and is everything you could have asked for out of one of the best top laners in the LEC, and then some. He's a super carry. He's somebody who can play weak side because he's so good isolated in 1v1s, not because he is, a weak side tank player who's going to eat up a ton of pressure from the enemy team, but rather just you can't leave him isolated with another top laner because he will beat them. He's a very scary player to play into, and he's been really good at the start of this year for BDS as well. I would argue definitively their best player on the team, and if that continues to be a case as it has been for the time since Adam has been called back up here to the LEC, then this is a massive problem for every other top laner. Top lane's a very stacked role, but Adam is that good. He can take advantage of players like that. Labrav was also fantastic in this one. He has been the second best player on this team across this split so far. The Blitzcrank has been super fun to watch. Really like watching him on playmakers, on something that he can be super proactive on. And he's a really good player. I think we're at the point where we're going to easily say that he is one of the best supports in the region. I think top 2 is certainly not out of the realm of possibility with him and Mickey X as the 2 best. I think that that's actually a pretty realistic thing to say at this point with Labrav, and that's great. It's really good to see him be able to live up to the potential that I think a lot of us saw with him on Vitality all those years ago. Him and Ice have very good synergy. Ice was a bit of a passenger this game, but his, mechanics were solid. Like, he didn't get caught out. He didn't make any major mistakes. The Ashe was just good. He didn't really have to do a whole ton because LeBron was creating so many different plays for him, but Ice was good enough, right? Nuke was solid on the Azir, did a lot of damage in the back half. Sheo, solid on the Vi, was able to control tempo in the early game, but this was really Adam and LeBron for me that really stood out as the carries for BDS, as they kind of have over the course of their entire tenure in the LEC last year. And then for Fnatic on the other side, it just opens up a can of worms and some worries about this team, and most of it come from the top side. I like Oscar. I think he's a solid player, but every single game that they have won this split, Fnatic that is, both games that they won in week number 1, Oscar was on K'Sante, and he got to kind of just do whatever he wanted in the top lane, and he was able to win the matchup, and he looked good, but in both the games that he's been taken off of K'Sante, he has been exposed, like genuinely exposed, and it doesn't really matter what they have put him on, either a carry or a tank, he looks exposed on both. That is a bit concerning. Oscar is also the type of player that tends to lose bad matchups a little bit harder than maybe your average top laner. So for all the people that are claiming that Oscar is going to kind of break out this year and definitively become, one of the best top laners in the LEC, I don't know about that. Adam made him look pretty foolish in this game, and he had the audacity to pick Udyr blind into a player who has the counter picks in his repertoire to be able to take advantage of that. So you just don't love the idea here for Oscar Renan, and there are some concerns about whether or not he's going to be good enough for Fnatic to actually compete for a title, or whether or not it's going to be a bit of a concern. They didn't even ban out K'Sante in this game. They just didn't pick it, and that is also something that, is a concern. June was really bad in this game as well. I've really not been all that impressed with June in the LEC. I know he's been definitely, I want to make it clear, he's definitely been better in the LEC than he was in the LCK. He was miserable in the LCK. We just saw his lane mate in Taiyun over in the LCK get benched. Finally, no offense to Taiyun, but we just, that bot lane was so miserable that I'm surprised that team didn't make a change earlier. And June over here in the LEC has just kind of been there. He's never really been a big playmaker for this team. The bot lane hasn't really been all that good in terms of the isolated 2v2. If you look at the stats and the metrics, June's just kind of been there, and I think a lot of people were hyping him up as, oh, he's this Korean who's going to come in and be one of the best supports in the LEC. He's just not that guy, right? Like, anybody who watched the LCK last year would know that he's just not that guy. Even when he was on DRX Challengers, when I was watching the Challengers League, he just wasn't that guy. He's never really been that guy. This was a struggling game. Labrav outclassed him in basically every aspect as a playmaker and an initiator here. Humanoid and Razork and Noah, I guess they were generally fine. Humanoid stepped up a bit too much for my liking, but I mean, it's just really hard to deal with Blitzcrank and Olaf if you're in Orianna. There's really not a lot of easy tools there, so I don't want to blame him too much, but this was a top and support gap on both sides here. Fnatic really struggled in those two roles. BDS really excelled in those two roles. I think, Fnatic definitely has room to grow and room to get better, but for BDS, this team genuinely looks very good at the moment, and, maybe they are secretly one of the best teams in the league. They made finals last year. Who's to say they can't do it again this year at some point? And then moving on to our final game of day 1 here, our 5th game of the week. It was GIANTX taking on Corp. And GIANTX is going to pick up the win. Corp is going to move to 0-4 to start their LEC tenure. And really, it is not the start that I think they wanted. It is not the start that I think they expected. I will say this is going to be their easiest week of the season by a pretty large margin. They don't really have a ton of difficult games this week, and so, already losing the first one, GX is a very beatable team in a lot of different respects, but they absolutely outclassed them in this one. Corp is definitely on panic mode right now. You're freaking out. This feels like the worst team in the LEC, but for GX, nice win. Again, doesn't really change my perception of this team all that much. Their 2 wins are against Vitality and Corp, who at different points in time have looked like the worst team in the league. And so I don't really know how good this team actually is. I didn't really think they were going to be all that good at the beginning of the year. They moved up to number 7 in my power rankings last week, purely because the rest of the league, the bottom 3 just felt so clearly like the bottom 3, and GX was just kind of a little better than that. But, this was a pretty good game from them, and I think the most encouraging thing that you can say about GX is that the player that's probably playing the best for them right now is Jackie's in the mid lane. Their young, Czech mid laner that they brought in with basically no experience at any major level. He had not played anywhere outside of the Czech League for Entropic, before joining the LEC here, and You know, if anybody knows about the Czech League, it's not the most prestigious of the ERLs. It's not the French League, it's not the Spanish League, it's not even the German League, right? You know, you're not getting top level experience there, and for him to just kind of get inserted into the LEC and have these games already where he looks pretty good, it's very encouraging. It shows that, you know, they kind of knew what they were doing when they went out to grab him. So he's going to get player of the game here on the Akali. Akali's looked a lot better here in week 2. This was a champion that looked super weak in week number 1. Obviously, we know how strong Akali can be in the right situation, but I think a lot of players were just playing it in bad situations or not necessarily using her to her fullest extent. We've really seen the extent of what Akali can do on day number 1 here of week 2, and that's a very good thing to say. If you give him more playmakers, Jackies that is, if you give him more, you know, champions that can be, you know, the front of the agency, somebody that, you know, has agency and can make their own, you know, plays and decisions, then I think that's good for GX overall. He clearly feels like somebody you can invest into and win games through. I thought Ignar was also really good in this game on the Senna. Senna Seraphine is still a really strong bot lane. We're seeing it everywhere across the world right now. Basically every LEC team that's been willing to pick it up has done well on it. And that's a good thing. That's you want to see, you know, teams pick up the thing that is the strongest. Double support item is really good right now, and this is one of the bot lanes that can abuse it at a really high level. Ignar actually didn't play a ton of Senna last year because he played a ton of Tahm Kench, whereas FBI was playing Senna. So he is familiar with Senna lanes. He knows how they work, but this time he is the one piloting and operating the marksman in this case. I think Peach played well on the Xin Zhao. Odo was fine in the top side, was definitely better than Cabo Shard. Kind of destroyed him in the laning phase, but Cabo's been losing to everybody in the laning phase. GX just looked like the better team, and I would say that's more concerning to KC than it is good to GX. I am very worried about KC. Everybody on this team was garbage in this game. I mean, you could make an argument that Upset continues to be the one player that is not playing awful on this roster, but, you know, it's not like he's really changing the game. It's not like he's going out of his way to win games for KC. He just doesn't really have an opportunity to play the game at all, and so I can't say that he's playing bad, that kind of situation, but everybody else on this team is playing bad. Dud of the game was honestly more difficult than it has been in a very long time here for KC, because do I give it to Bo because he went 0-7-3 on the Vi? I don't know. He at least had pressure and he was trying to do something on the map. Do I give it to Seiken because he got his signature champion and his mechanics looked like a Silver 1 player? I don't think so, because at the very least, you know, he wasn't actively running into the middle of teams and dying. He was just not doing anything on Azir. I'm going to give it to Targamas in the support position, who was genuinely awful in this game, and honestly has been really bad this split anyways. His mechanics just seem horrible. Like, I understand that his shot calling and his macro are supposed to be the strength of him, and that's always kind of been the strength of him, but man, he just cannot play against a lot of LEC talent. Like, Ignar made him look like an absolute chump in this game. Peach made him look like an absolute chump in this game on the Recon. It just feels like he is not locked in or in the zone. Targamas is one of those players that has shown that when his confidence is gone, his confidence is gone. We saw it on Excel last year when he got benched after the winter split. When he is not playing well, he really is not playing well, and he's been awful to start this split. Seiken has been awful to start this split. Cabo Shard has been getting gapped in every single top lane matchup to start this split. Bo, while he is trying to make plays, I see people being like, Bo's hard stuck on this team. Bo makes, you know, for every 2 good plays that Bo makes, he makes 4 bad plays. Like, that's just where we're at right now with KC. It doesn't feel like there is any way that this team can win a game at the current moment, and that's super concerning. I don't really know what this team needs to do. I think the start would be to start peeling for Upset and at least give him a chance to do something. Again, I'm not saying that that would definitely happen because Upset's been way too passive this year, but at least give him an opportunity to try to carry the game when you draft him, Kaisa, for crying out loud. Like, I don't really know what else to say when it comes to KC here. I don't really have a lot of faith in this team. I don't really expect them to get better. I don't really know what to do at this point. This was going to be one of their easier games left on the schedule. They still have teams like Vitality and Rogue left, you know, which are obviously winnable games for them. But, you know, GX should be a team that if KC was anywhere near the level that people wanted them to be, they could beat, and they couldn't do it. It's not only that they couldn't beat them, they got run over here. And so, yeah, KC feels like the worst team in the LEC right now. And then for GX on the other side, it's a nice win. But again, all of your wins are against bad teams. I'm really not sold on this being actually a good team. Jackies looks good when he gets to play against, you know, Seiken, who's whiffing every Azir, but he looked miserable when he had to play against actually top-tier mid laners. Definitely going to be more interesting to see how this team grows and develops, but for now, I feel basically the same about them as I did before going into this game. And now we get to move on to day number 2 here in week 2, and kicking off our middle day was a matchup between Mad Lions and Team BDS. And BDS is going to pick up their 4th win of the split. I think they really only need one more to confirm that they've locked themselves in for playoffs, but really this is one of the best teams in the league at the current moment. Their consistency is incredible. Their talent is absolutely there, and any worries that I think a lot of people had about the shot calling and the decision making of this team, I think a lot of that should be, done and dusted by this point. That's on the back burner because this team is genuinely just really good at League of Legends. That's the difference, right? Mad is a good team. Mad knows what they're doing. Mechanically speaking, they can go toe-to-toe with a couple of teams. They've been interesting at the start of the year, but for them to get blown out again here by BDS, it's not a great look, but it does show how good BDS is, and I think at this point, we really have to start acknowledging them as one of the best teams in the entire league. Player of the game, no-brainer, going to Labrov on this one. He was amazing in their first game of the week. He was just as amazing, if not better, in their second game of the week here. Labrov has been awesome for a long time, and people have just not really been awake to see it. He really hasn't been on a lot of great teams over the course of his career. I saw some comments, I think specifically this one was on Reddit, where it was like, what did BDS do to Labrov to get these kinds of performances out of him? He was so good last year and so good this year. I think people genuinely forget, and I understand, like, there's a lot of new fans specifically to the LEC, or, recency bias taking over a lot of people's heads. Either way, I understand. This guy was Rookie of the Year, like 5 years ago. People forget that as a prospect, when he first joined Vitality alongside Comp, he was like a really big deal. He was one of the most interesting support prospects in all of the LEC. He was a top 5 guy, basically from day one. Really, the first opportunity he got to not be on a bottom tier Vitality team was when they finally went all in 2022, where it was like, okay, we're bringing in Carzzy, we're bringing in Perks, we're bringing in all these people, and, we're going to push to try and dominate the scene. We're going to push to try and dominate the LEC. We're going to be this big super team, and, we're going to see how that works out. Obviously, it didn't. They ended up not even making playoffs in the summer split, no chance of making Worlds, and Labrov did not play well that split. Him and Carzzy had very bad chemistry together, and it just didn't end up working out. He goes to BDS in 2023, revitalizes that image, revitalizes that idea, but this is a player who's been good long before he came over to this BDS team. I think he's just been given an opportunity to show everybody that he's good, this time with a genuinely good team around him. So very happy to see that for Labrov. This is a genuine superstar in the support position, somebody who's going to be near the top of the position rankings for quite a long time. Ice continues to overperform. He really has made Varus kind of his signature pick here in the LEC. He's been good on other things as well, but the Varus, I think, is definitely something that he plays a lot better than other LEC AD carries. We've seen players struggle to have an impact in the late game on this really long-range poke style, specifically if they go lethality, and Ice is just better at that than I think a lot of the other ADCs. I don't think his mechanics are, like, ridiculous. He's not solo winning games here for BDS, but he's playing his role about as well as anybody could play that role. And so, that's good. Sheo and Adam continue to be really strong. Adam dominated the top lane matchup again. Adam and Labrov really are the core and the strength of this team in my eyes, but Sheo and Nuke continue to be good. Ice continues to be good. BDS is a genuinely scary team to run into. One of the best in the LEC right now, and, I'm not surprised. This team retained 4 of the 5 members that went to the finals last year. This is not a huge shock, or it shouldn't be a huge shock to a lot of people, but for Mad on the other side, I think some of the weaknesses of this young team are really starting to show themselves as they face tougher competition. BDS is not a team that you can just walk over, and I think mechanically speaking, this is the first game where it felt like Mad was genuinely just outplayed, where not only was the early game bad, but the late game was bad, the decision-making was bad, but, the laning was bad, the isolated 1v1s or the 2v2 was bad, the jungle matchup was bad, everything just kind of went wrong for Mad in this game, which is really not what you're looking for. Dud of the game is going to go to Merwin once again on the top side. This Kennen was just completely useless, got destroyed in lane by the Renekton, had no prio and wasn't really able to move, and then took the longest and most unbelievable flank, I guess, rotations that you could possibly take. I don't even really know what he was thinking. It took him forever to get into any of these fights. It was basically a 4v5 for Mad Lions, and they were certainly never going to win that down like 6k gold in the back half of the game. Again, don't really understand what he was thinking in a lot of these engages. Maybe he's going for this miracle flank, but he wasn't very good at them, and so he's going to get dud of the game. You could give this to Supa and Alvaro, who were basically just fodder for Labrov to hook on Blitzcrank in this game. You could give this to Frescoe, who was just completely outplayed by Nuke, isolated in the 1v1 matchup. Corky is a pick that, yes, is very consistent when you scale into the late game, but Nico was one of the champions that can really punish Corky early, and we saw that here. Even Elyoya couldn't save this. Not a particularly active game coming in from the rel. Just got out-jungled early on by Sheo because of the pressure that Vi and Nico can put on in the middle of the map, and they just moved it around, got the Blitzcrank rolling, and BDS was able to snowball it from there. This was probably Mad's worst game of the season. That's okay. You're going to have these road bumps when you are such a young team, especially going into a team that's as good as BDS is right now, but you need to be able to respond. You need to be able to bounce back quickly. This final game of the week is going to be important. Going 0-3 in week 2 is certainly not what I think Mad wanted on their bingo card. And then for BDS, great win. This is a legit team that I think could actually make a lot of noise. Top 4 is very important here in the LEC, but top 2 is even more important. And there's really not a lot of reasons to believe that BDS couldn't be a top 2 team if everything goes right. I'm not sure I'm just going to sit here and guarantee you that they are going to be that, but they're certainly on the path to it right now. They looked really, really good in this game. And now moving on to game 2 here on day number 2, and this one went pretty much how you would expect. It was Fnatic taking on Rogue, and Fnatic is able to get the job done, as they absolutely should in this instance, because they are the better team by a pretty large margin, and it's nice to see Fnatic continue to get better. Obviously, day 1, not exactly how you wanted things to go. The BDS game certainly was not ideal for them, but BDS has obviously proven that they are a very good team, that they are a team that you shouldn't be too mad about losing to. Your only other losses to SK Gaming, who was just white hot in week number 1. This is a nice win to get yourself back on track. If there was ever a team to play that you could guarantee was going to get you back on track, Rogue is a pretty good one right now in the LEC. They might be the single worst team in terms of what they offer on the Rift. I know they won a game against G2. That's awesome. I'm happy for them, but they're just not a very good League of Legends team, and Fnatic is definitely a good League of Legends team. They were able to outskill and most specifically out-macro Rogue throughout the entirety of this one. I think that's a pretty big positive, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Razork in the jungle. There's a case to be made that Razork has been this team's best player over the course of the regular season. It's either him or Humanoid, and that's a fantastic sentence to hear. This was a big reason why I was really in on Fnatic after week number 1, is because my problem with this team and with this org and with this collection of players over the past even 2 years, really, is just that it's never really felt like everyone is clicking at the same time. And while that's still kind of true, like Oscar is definitely struggling at the current moment going up against anybody that isn't the worst top laners in the league. Noah and June have really not been all that good as a bot lane, with the exception of this game in particular, in my opinion. But the really, really positive thing to take away here is that Razork and Humanoid are actually playing well together. And that's just not something that's happened for Fnatic in a long time in the regular season. So you definitely live with some of the trade-offs that you have to take to get that, but Razork was awesome in this game on the Vi, was super active in the early game, which is something that Rogue just never is going to have an answer to with how this team likes to play the game. I thought Razork did a great job of being able to control the tempo, being able to control the pacing, and just moving around the map, being exactly where he needed to be. By the time we got to the mid to late game, we're constantly finding these like 5v3 or 4v2 fights that are in favor of Fnatic. It was never even, and a lot of that was Razork just constantly being one step ahead of Marcoon on the other side of the map. So really good stuff from him. I think the other player that I do have to shout out is Noah in this one. This was, in my opinion, clearly the best game that Noah has played this season. He's really not been all that good. He hasn't really been awful, but he's not been a game changer down in the bot lane. He's not really getting resources. He's not really doing anything in the earlier mid game. He's not really winning all that much isolated in the 2v2, as I talked about earlier. And so, you know, he's just kind of been a guy, which I don't think is the development you wanted to see from Noah going into year 2 here. You wanted to see him kind of take over and be one of the best ADCs in Europe, because I think he has the talent to do so, but I don't think June has really helped him out a ton. I think playing Kalista in a matchup like this, though, it's the best way to get your mind back on track, because Rogue is never going to be able to answer that kind of pressure early on, especially if you're not getting any sort of attention from Marcoon in the bot lane, which, you know, they didn't this game. I think Noah was really able to kind of flex his, you know, mechanical difference over Comp's, his mechanical prowess, that he is, he's just better than Comp as a player is, and I think we were able to see that here. June was a little bit more active this time on the Nico. I think this is the kind of pick that maybe June might want to go towards a bit more. He's really not been like the massive liability, but he's certainly not been a positive for this team, in my opinion, and, you know, putting him on something that can be a little bit more aggro, that has scaling potential as well, and can just, you know, kind of be a team fight, you know, threat and presence, you know, play with the rest of the group. I think that's going to help out Fnatic a bit more, leave Noah up to his own devices a bit more. I think generally speaking, that's good. Humanoid continues to be solid. He's really not making the same kinds of mistakes that he has made in previous years. That was always my problem with Humanoid, was not that the good plays weren't there, but that the bad plays were just really there, and he's not made a ton of those bad plays this year. I would argue that this has been one of the better Humanoid regular seasons in a very long time so far in winter. And then Oscar gets a participation trophy. He did a good job shutting down Shigenda and really, keeping the Cassante from being relevant at any point in the game, but he didn't really actively do anything else outside of that. So, credit to Oscar, but Razork really is the star of this team, and I thought Noah did a really good job capitalizing on the setup that Razork had here. And then for Rogue, I mean, what else can I say at this point? This team is what they are. They're incredibly slow, they're incredibly passive, and they just lose. Right? It's just kind of what they do. Zoelise is unfortunately going to get my dud of the game. He's really been the best player on this team over the course of this split, but you're a rookie, and when the rest of the team is crumbling and fumbling around you, it's inevitable that eventually you're going to have a bad game, and this was the one for Zoelise. I don't want to sit here and say that he's a bad player or anything like that. I think mentally it's probably getting to him a bit, but this was not a particularly good Heimerdinger performance. The Varus really wasn't good from comp. He wasn't really doing any damage. Larson was trying to create on the Tristana, a champion he is notoriously bad at, and they continuously pick for him, but Markoon was so slow on the Maokai. This was also basically a 4v5, because I don't know if Shigenda was actually playing or if he fell asleep at his computer. I didn't even really see him after the 10-minute mark, and so I don't really know. This Rogue team's just really bad. There isn't even a ton of analysis that I can give you, because it's just team slow, team not make decision, team late to every objective, team lose. Like, that's what Rogue is right now. They are one of the weakest teams that I've seen in the LEC in a very long time, and I wouldn't expect that to change as we continue to go throughout the split. This is a bad Rogue team, and Fnatic was able to take advantage of that. Razork and Humanoid continue to look good, and Noah and June probably having their best game as a duo in the bot lane in terms of laning. So proud of what Fnatic was able to offer here, but again, you got to do it against teams that aren't Rogue. You got to be able to beat some of the top teams if you want to actually compete to be a finals team, which I think is the expectation and the goal here for Fnatic. And now moving on to the middle of the week here with the third game of the second day, and it was a top of the table clash. One of the most interesting of the entire regular season. It's Team Heretics taking on G2 Esports. And G2 is going to be able to pick up the big win here. It's G2 versus G3 in a lot of instances. A very, very fun matchup. A lot of former G2 players, 4 former G2 players over on Heretics, obviously. And then, a player who's played against G2 a lot in Kaiser. And then, the modern version of G2. What has become of that organization? It's the modern version that ends up coming out on top in this one. And this was a really, really nice victory for them. I think we've been talking about some of the flaws that G2 has had over the start of the split here, where it's like, I don't know if Hans is playing particularly well. I would like to see, Broken Blade perhaps be a little bit more dominant in the top lane after him being like the best top laner in Europe last year. And a lot of those things are still true, but a lot of those things were not problems here in this game. They were clearly fired up. They clearly wanted to win this one. This was a personal rivalry for them, and I think that they came out guns blazing because of it. They had a much better draft than Heretics did on the other side, where they drafted, quite frankly, low damage outside of the Azir in that comp, and I think you're really relying a lot on Perks being able to get ahead, and while Perks did do a good job in this game, it just wasn't enough. G2 was very much in sync and in tune, and they really wanted to win this. So let's talk about it. Player of the game pretty easily is going to go to Yike in the jungle. Always fun seeing Yankos versus Yike because, obviously Yike is the person who replaced Yankos on G2, the longtime jungler and, probably greatest jungler in European history. So a lot of shoes to fill here for Yike, but he has always played well against Yankos in particular. This Lilia game, very fun, very complete. He was able to dominate the early game against a Xin Zhao, which is actually a really hard thing to do as Lilia. Not a particularly easy matchup in my opinion. Not a guy who plays a ton of this matchup, but I would expect it to be rather difficult against a champion like Xin Zhao that can just kind of fight you forever and has a way to get on and stick onto you. So big credit to Yike for that, but it was really the team fighting that always is going to set Lilia apart, and Yike's mid-game macro is so darn good, man. There's a reason I really believe in him as already one of the best junglers in Europe, and one of the top 2, maybe top 1 junglers in Europe at his absolute best, and that's because his macro is actually phenomenal. He does not play like somebody who's only been in the league for a little over a year at this point. He plays like a veteran, and his macro was just straight up better than Yankos's in this game, which is certainly not something that you say about a lot of matchups, but Yike was phenomenal. The Lilia was doing a billion damage. That champion is in a very strong state right now, and we're seeing that. A lot of teams are starting to pick her up a bit more, and we're really seeing the overall potential of what Lilia can do, and Yike, I think, did a really good job of bringing that out here. Caps' scoreline might not look super dominant, but what he did do was completely shut off Perks in this game. Perks actually played really well, in my opinion. His mechanics were incredibly good on the Azir. He was able to do a lot of damage when he was allowed to in some of these fights, but the problem was that he was constantly being zoned by the Nautilus and by the Tristana. They were both just sitting there making sure the Azir couldn't play the game and basically, begging someone else to be able to win it for Heretics, and that just wasn't going to happen with the comp that Heretics ended up drafting. So credit to Caps, credit to Mickey in that same vein, who had a good game, and then Hansama, actually, this is probably his best game of the split. Really complete overall performance, was really strong in lane, was able to, generate a really strong gold lead, which I really was not expecting in this matchup, but was able to transition that very easily into late game pressure, into team fight pressure, Broken Blade won top lane. Everybody ended up doing their job. Yike was definitely the primary carry for G2 in terms of damage in this game and in terms of macro, but everybody really, was locked in and stepped up for this. This was a phenomenal macro game from G2, and that kind of is, I guess, a symbol of what they've been over the course of this split up until this point, which is a really good macro team. I mean, you can say what you want about some of the mechanics on some of these players, whether or not they've been able to win on certain picks, but they always end up getting the job done in the mid to late game because they know where they need to be more so than basically any other team at this level. We've kind of been talking about what happens if a team comes up and starts to punish G2. Well, this is not a G2 that is punishable. This is the version of them that would coast to an LEC title if they were able to play like it every single game. Not saying they will be able to, but clearly it is in there for them, and this is why everyone had them ranked #1 in the preseason. But for Heretics, you're not going to worry too much about this loss. You probably would have liked to be a bit more competitive in this game, but again, you put yourself at such a hole in draft, in my opinion. This is just not particularly good. You rely a ton on Xin Zhao and Azir. The jungle mid duo here is ridiculously important for what Heretics wants to do because the Jhin really isn't going to be a hard carry for you. The Braum's not really enabling the Jhin all that much, and you've got a Poppy on the top side that's basically only here to try and stop Tristana, and so you're not really in that great of a spot already from the jump, but I think it only got worse once G2 started spiraling out of control. Dead of the game for me is going to go to Flakked in the bot lane. I hate giving it to him because I don't even think he necessarily was like atrocious, although he wasn't good positioning-wise in this game, but I mean, he was useless. That Jhin is completely useless. I'm not an anti-Jhin person. I think that champion can be ridiculously strong in the right circumstance, especially in solo queue. There are a lot of good opportunities to play Jhin, but at the pro level, it just does not work right now. Like, you need more damage than this, or you need longer range than this. Jhin just doesn't offer the same things that a lot of the other top ADCs do, and if you want a more supportive, a more, utility is, I guess, the word, oriented AD carry, you just need to pick Ashe, or you need to pick Senna right now, or Seraphine down in the bot lane. Obviously, both of those were banned in this game, but you banned out the Ashe yourself, and it's not like Hans plays this ridiculously strong Ashe. It's not like you couldn't early pick this. I think it was just straight up stronger than, Jhin in this matchup. You left up the Varus. You banned out 4 ADCs, and you left up Varus. It's just a crazy thing to do, in my opinion, and I think Flakked ended up paying the price. Kaiser was also not very good in this game on the Braum. Again, Braum's not going to look good at all if your team doesn't do any damage because all he can do is sit there and eat damage so that your team can do damage. And if he dies super fast in a fight and nothing else gets done, then the Braum doesn't actually matter. The Braum doesn't actually accomplish all that much. Like I said, I think Perks mechanically was actually really good in this game and was definitely the best player on Heretics, but it just didn't matter. G2 made it a priority to shut him down, Caps in particular, like I said, early on in this game. Jankos got out jungled. Wunder was nothing on the Poppy on the top side. Team Heretics was just not as good. TH was just not as good this game, and that really is just the crux of the story. So hopefully we can see them bounce back a bit, but this is the G2 that I think we've all been waiting to see. This is the team that is #1 in the power rankings for a reason. They're sitting at 4-1. They have the opportunity to confirm their spot in the playoffs by the end of the week if they are able to win that final game. But for now, this version of what we've seen on this day, week 2, day 2, this is the best day that they've had, in my opinion, in 2024 so far, and I think that's a really good sign. Now moving on to the 4th game of day #2 here, and this one was kind of interesting. Two teams that have gone in slightly different directions to start this split. It's SK Gaming taking on GIANTX, and SK does get to pick up their 4th win of the split here. They continue to look better than the bad teams in the league, and I think that that's a confidence booster. They didn't look particularly good on day 1 of week 2, and people were concerned that they were kind of a one-week wonder anyways, and so nice bounce back here against GX. This is a very beatable team, and it's nice to see SK actually going out there and beating them like they should in this instance. I think Most of the players on the team here did their job. Actually, I would say everybody looking at it did their job. Not everybody was a star, but everybody did their job in this game, none more so than my player of the game, Nisqy, in the mid lane. This guy just wins, and he's a lot more mechanically talented than people think he is. We were talking about Jackie's, we'll get to him once we get to GX, but we're talking about him being able to beat a lot of the lower tier mid laners, be able to capitalize on the mistakes that some of those other players were making. Like we saw with Seiken earlier on in this week, Nisqy is not one of those players. He is one of the best mid laners in the LEC, and he has been for quite a long time, and mechanically speaking, this was a carry game from Nisqy on the Azir. He can have games like this where he gets a lot of the resources and he starts to take over. Honestly, this was a style that Mad Lions went more and more to as they got more comfortable with their, team comp and everything. Obviously, the atmosphere might not have been perfect, but him and Elyoya did have good chemistry on the Rift for the most part when they played together, and I think a lot of that started to develop when Nisqy started getting a lot more resources rather than being the one to give up resources to help his jungler, and so it's good to see that carry over here to SK Gaming. Was really given a lot of responsibility, I guess you could say, in this comp, and I think he came through in the clutch. He can really step up, and, I like Nisqy a lot as a player. I think the league is better when Nisqy is good. That is clear because people on Twitter love to hate Nisqy, and that just creates a lot of these fun dynamics where every single time he wins, you get this really funny tweet that everyone gets mad at in the replies, and it just makes for good content, in my opinion. So it's good to see him kind of still be, I don't want to say on top, because SK is not like the best team in the league or anything, but, actually being very successful and still playing at a very high level. It's good to see that. I think Doss had a very sneakily great game here on the Alistair. Not only was he very good in terms of the engages and what he offered, but, we'll get to Ignar on the other side. He was a hook magnet. Doss was a hook magnet in this game on the Alistair. And that's the perfect person to be a hook magnet. Not that there are a lot of ideal hooks on the side of SK. You don't really want to hit the Alistair. You don't really want to hit the Renekton. You don't really want to hit the Maokai. So not really a lot of great options here once the Blitzcrank was locked in, but Doss was the one that was eating up a lot of those hooks and really opened up a lot of space for Nisqy to actually carry in some of the late game fights that ended up closing out the game. So credit to Doss. Irrelevant had another good game. I will say maybe I'm just a little lower on him. I don't really know, but I continuously see, Irrelevant's the best top laner in the league, and he was the best top laner in the league last year as well. It's just a claim that I think it's too rich. It's significantly too rich for me. I get it. Irrelevant has really good games. When he wins really hard. Odoamne was really bad in this game. The Kennen looked miserable. We'll talk about that in a second, but Irrelevant also has bad games. He is more volatile than I think people give him credit for. He is on the same level as some of the top laners, but can you tell me that you would rather have Irrelevant than Adam? Can you tell me that you'd rather have Irrelevant than Broken Blade? I don't really know if I'm willing to say that right now. I think top 4 is very realistic for him. Top 3, I think, at his absolute best, or if you really just go off of results, I think top 3 is possible, but I don't really know if I would take him at number 1. I don't know if that is a conversation that I'm willing to have up until this point. Again, I think it's recency bias. I think it's people ignoring some of the bad games because they like him as a player. And trust me, I like him a lot as a player as well. I just think that it's not my job to ignore the bad games. It's my job to try and evaluate a player. And I think, Irrelevant is still a little bit more inconsistent than you would like out of a top 1 guy, but he can win and he does win a lot. So really still like him in that respect. Isma and Exakick were kind of just there in this game. They didn't really have to do a whole ton. The Kalista was dealing damage, but mostly it was the Azir in the back half of the game, and the Maokai was setting it up. A lot of these objectives, but he was also the one who just kind of went in and died in a lot of these fights to open up space for the rest of the team to be able to win them, so I can't really criticize him too much. In general, SK didn't really have any trouble in this game, and that's good. You want to see them win pretty convincingly here. And then for GX, they're just not as good as the good teams. I don't really know what else to say. This is very similar to what I said about Rogue. They're not as passive or anything like that, but they're one of those teams that, yeah, they're going to beat Rogue, and they're going to beat K-Corp, and they're going to beat the really, really bad teams in the league, but they're not on the same level as SK or the top 5 teams in the LEC. It's just a difference, right? GX is going to be the gatekeeper in terms of the bottom of the league, and right now, that means right around number 7 or number 8 or number 6 or somewhere in that zone. Ignar is going to get dud of the game here on the Blitzcrank. Like I said, I don't think he landed an impactful hook all game long. Was mostly landing them on the Alistair. When he did occasionally get them on champions like the Kalista, she would just flash out out and it wouldn't really matter and you could just win the fight anyways. And so you're not really looking at any sort of consequential factor. It was not Labrav on the Blitzcrank. That I will definitely say. But Jackie's really struggled in the mid lane on the Yone, got completely outplayed by Niski, who is just a better player than him at the current moment. Jackie's has shown a lot of upside, but again, this is what happens when he plays against one of the better mid laners in the region. And Odo, I think, really struggled on the top side. Kennen was one of his classic picks from back in the day. He used to be known as almost a Kennen one-trick when he first started in the LEC. It's really frustrating to see him show up and perform like this, where the Kennen was basically completely useless in this game. Patrick tried his best on the Draven. He was given a lot of gold, but this is not the first time that Patrick's been given Draven, been given some gold in the early game, and then completely fallen off in the late game. It's just not an ideal circumstance at all for GX, and so like I said, this team is the gatekeepers. They are going to be better than teams like, the worst, the bottom two in the league, but they're not going to be as good as teams like SK that have genuine upside and genuine players. And I think that's where GX is probably going to land. And then for SK on the other side, this is a good team. I don't know if they're a great team. We're going to have to see towards the back half of this week when things really get interesting for them. But at least for now, this is a really nice win. Niski continues to look good. Exekick and Doss in particular actually continues to look very good this split. Isma was the star of week number 1. Been a little bit more passive in week 2, but still has looked solid, and people are all in on Irrelevant, it seems, in terms of public perception, even if I'm not nearly as heavily into it. SK is a very good team. We're going to have to see where they end up landing in a couple of weeks, though. And then moving on to our final game of day number 2 here, the middle of the week, and it was a banger. Your favorite game of the year, if you are a masochist, it was Team Vitality taking on K-Corp. And Vitality is going to be able to pick up the win. K-Corp moves to 0-5 to start their LEC tenure. The French Civil War, the French Revolution, whatever you want to call this matchup, it delivered on everything it was promised. It was the two teams that looked completely inept after week number 1, looking completely inept against each other. And we all got to appreciate it. We all got to witness it head to head. Not everybody in this game was a complete train wreck. In fact, there were a couple of players where I'm like, this is the best game they played all split on both sides of this matchup. But K-Corp threw significantly harder, and that means they're the ones that are going to be walking out, starting 0-5 in last place. Vitality with their second win in a row, their second win of the week. After starting 0-3, yes, they're against Rogue and K-Corp, the two worst teams in the league, but still being able to pick up those 2 wins is a very important step in not being one of the 2 worst teams in the league, which is all you need to be in order to make playoffs. And so really good stuff for Vitality here in terms of being able to win, not in terms of the gameplay. I want to make that abundantly clear. Vitality still played like ass in a majority of this game. Most of these players were making horrible decisions. The macro on both sides of this matchup was, I can't even describe it. I mean, truly, neither of these teams know how to play actual League of Legends. Both of them were just slamming their face on the keyboard. And eventually, Vitality was able to kill the Nexus, which is good. But the one player who I do think was trying his best to carry everybody across the finish line was VTO in the mid lane on the Ahri. He still made some mistakes, and that champion can sometimes just be a little bit irrelevant in some late game team fights. If you're really not super far ahead, you want to try and get tempo on Ahri. And when games go 40 minutes, she typically just isn't as effective towards the back half in pro at the very least. And we were seeing a bit of that towards the back half, but even so, VTO on assassin-esque champions with high mobility and high agency. This is what I wanted to see. He crushed Rogue on this on the Akali earlier in the week. He crushes KC here on the Ahri. I love to see this idea coming out from Vitality. This is the kind of comp they should be drafting probably for the rest of the split to get the most out of the players that they have signed. Karzi and Hilly got to play Xayah Rakan. That's fine. You can be stable. You can be a late game carry. You can kind of be a little bit of anything that you need. You can win early if you really want to with Xayah Rakan. So you've got options there. Douglas on a Maokai that you can barely mess up, and Photon on Cassante, who's just mega broken at the current moment and will be mega broken because his kit is just stronger than everybody else's. But VTO really was the primary guy here. There were moments where Hylissang would go in 1v4 and just die for no reason. There would be moments where Douglas was way too early to an objective and just die, and he would be way too late to an objective and just die. And, Photon could sometimes just be caught in a side lane for no reason, or VTO would TP top, or, whatever, right? Like, there were mistakes in terms of decisions in this game. Trust me, this was not a clean game by any means from either side, but VTO at the very least was winning fights when he was a part of them, and that's a very important thing here. Nice to see Douglas actually get a lot of objectives in this game. I would say Bo was probably the better jungler of the two of them, but I don't think Douglas was awful. Karzi didn't immediately die in every fight, and that's honestly more than I could say for him in week number 1, so it was good to see that, and Photon was actually pretty solid on the Cassante. Photon's actually quietly had a pretty good year. Pretty good split up until this point. Just hasn't really mattered because he's playing top lane and he's often on tank duty with this team because they have so many aggressive players that they want to see on more, proactive playmakers, things like that. So You know, nice to see Vitality pick up the win. I'm not going to freak out. I'm not going to overreact. I'm not going to say Vitality is genuinely a good team because this was bad. This was not a good win. This was a bad win, but a win is a win, and you're one win closer to actually getting yourself into the playoffs, and that's all that really matters at the end of the day is just not being bottom two. This is a really good step in that direction for Vitality. And then for K-Corp on the other side, God, they're bad. They're just not good. They're not good at anything. They're really not good at anything. Bo had pressure in the early game, and honestly, Bo played fine. He made some pretty big mistakes in the last team fight, but honestly, like, he was good for a majority of this game, and I know people are like, always looking out for a reason to cheer for Bo. I know he's a very popular player, and if you go on Reddit, you're constantly going to see people trying to defend him. He was good this game. I'm certainly not going to deny that. He has not been the problem for K-Corp here like I thought he would be. He's certainly not been the solution because he's really not good at playing from behind, and this team is always playing from behind, but he's trying his best, and Seiken was actually genuinely good in this game. This is by far the best that Seiken has looked in the LEC, which is funny because it's coming against Vitality, the only team that he's actually played for in the LEC before K-Corp, and so nice to see a player that has, quite frankly, looked completely outclassed at this level actually show up and have a good game and really try to push this team forward, but everybody else is just not good. Cabochard has no impact on a champion that's so strong in Rumble in late game teamfights. It doesn't feel like the Rumble actually exists. He was getting outplayed by Ari on Rumble. That's not a good thing to be able to say. Upset was completely invisible once again this game. And Targamas, easy choice for dead of the game. What is he doing, man? Is he even an LEC caliber support? Like, does this guy need to go now? Because it's just miserable watching him play League of Legends. He has been so bad for K-Corp this split. He was so bad for Excel last split. This guy won the LEC on G2. This isn't just some guy. He's a champion at the LEC level. He went to Worlds. He was good at Worlds. And it's just so crazy to see how far he has fallen. His mechanics are just not there. His engage timings are just not there. His rel team fighting might have been some of the worst that I've seen from anybody in quite a long time. It was just bad. If I'm like, I don't really even know what to say about it. You know, Seiken finally had a good game. Bo didn't int this game away. You actually had an opportunity to win this, and Targamas was like, nope, we're gonna lose this one. We're gonna go 0-5, and you know, that's just how it's going to be. It's frustrating because it feels like at least one person on K-Corp every single game just completely runs it to the point of it being unwinnable. Whether it's Cabo in week 1, whether it's Seiken, whether it's Bo in week 1, whether it was Targamas so far in week 2. It's been somebody every game where it's just like, you make it so you can't win the game. And everybody's had their piece of the pie up until this point. This team is 0-5 for a reason. This is the worst team in the LEC. We're not even into day 3 yet. Obviously, they have an opportunity to end week number 2 with at least one win, which would be necessary for them to even really think about qualifying for the playoffs. I think 3 wins is probably the comfort zone. 2 wins will probably get you there because of teams like Vitality and Rogue and maybe even GIANTX just being really bad and having already gotten a lot of their easy games out of the way. But KC's got to get their shit into gear soon because this team is just not clicking on any level, and there's really not a lot of signs that it's going to get better for them at all. And then for Vitality, you know, I'm glad you won, but is this even really a win at the end of the day? You played really bad. You still got a lot to prove to me. This is still one of the worst teams in the league as far as I'm concerned. Maybe they're a little bit higher than they were at the end of last week. Maybe they're not bottom 2 because they were able to take a couple of wins over teams that are just worse than them at this point, but you got to prove to me that you can beat middle tier teams. You got to prove to me you can beat GIANTX. You got to prove to me you can beat Mad Lions. Those are the teams that you need to go out there and actually be able to win against for me to really start believing that this team has any chance of winning any games in the playoffs, because this certainly didn't do that for me. There are good moments. VTO, I think, is playing a ton better, but, you know, Photon's got to be able to get more carries and step up, and this bot lane and jungle really have to be better than what they have been this year. It's still a win for Vitality, but it's a win at the cost of genuinely feeling good, really, about this team at all. And now moving on to the third and final day of the LEC here in week number 2, and we get to kick it off with the battle between 4 and 1 teams. One of these two, whoever wins, will guarantee themselves a spot in the playoffs. It's SK Gaming taking on Team BDS. And BDS is going to be able to pick up the win. They're going to go 3-0 this week, and they are going to confirm their spot in the top 8 with a 5-1 start in the regular season. Awesome stuff from BDS. They continue to look like one of the scarier teams in the entire league. I think they continue to really exploit a lot of the current strong champions on the patch that they're playing on. Whereas other teams, I think, are more hesitant to go towards the things that are, quite frankly, super easy to execute on right now. Things like Varus, specifically things like Nico, things like Cassante, things like Xin Zhao. These are very straightforward champions that have a very clear goal and can really perform their duty either ahead or behind. And I think that really helps give a lot of flexibility to the BDS comp. SK, for their credit, tried their best in this game. They gave a lot of resources to Niski in the mid lane, but a couple of these lanes just didn't end up surviving. I think a lot of the luster has worn off of SK Gaming after that week number 1, and this was unfortunately just a byproduct of that. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Lebrov in the support position once again. What a week for Lebrov. I'm not going to spoil player of the week or anything like that, but Lebrov is absolutely in the running for that. 3 games of Blitzcrank and 3 miraculously, great playmaking games. Adam has continued to be really good, but Lebrov, I think maybe has been the best player on this team over the course of Winter Split so far. Really impressive stuff. Really happy to see him cement himself near the top of the support rankings. I don't want to go too far because, again, he's a good player, but he played 3 games of Blitzcrank and he dominated on all 3 this week. I'd love to see him do it on other champions as well. I'm not trying to pigeonhole him. Obviously, he can play other things. He was super successful on a lot of different champions last year as well, but I would just love to see him break out and be this gigantic playmaker and, quite frankly, the star that he was this week on other champions alongside the Blitzcrank, and I think that would make me feel a bit better. But Lebrov, over the course of week number 2, was phenomenal. One of the best players in the league for sure. The other player to really stand out here in this final game of the week for them is Nuke in the mid lane. Really happy to see him continue to grow and be super consistent. Nico is just such a crazy pick right now. I know I don't complain about picks too much on this channel, but Nico is so easy to execute on. It's actually insane. Those ultimates in the late game, they're really not all that difficult. I don't mean to be, the stickler here, but watching Nuke lose lane to the Tristana, not really have pressure as Nico in the early game, which is pretty bad, but still be one of the most useful, if not the most useful player in the entire game, because Nico ultimate is just that strong. Like, if you have Flash and you have Proto Belt or Rocket Belt or whatever it's called now, it's really hard to screw it up. It's really hard to not execute on that champion at this level. And, Nuke obviously makes it look easy, but, he had a really big impact on this game. Ice was awesome, went deathless in this one on the Varus. He plays off of Lebrov surprisingly well. You would think that these two had been playing for longer because he definitely feels like one of those players that just has inherent synergy with the rest of the team that's playing around him. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the rest of the team did all play together last year, and he's just this piece that gets to kind of slot in wherever they need him, and they really haven't asked him to do all that much this year, but he's been very good in the role that he has played. Adam continues to win every matchup he's in. Sheo continues to look pretty solid. Honestly, he's not been the superstar on BDS that he was at times last year, but he's still been pretty darn good. This Xin Zhao game was actually really strong from him, and it's just exciting to see BDS continue to be relevant. A lot of people wrote them off in the preseason. A lot of people wrote off that, losing Crownie was going to be too big of a deal, but I'm glad to see that the faith that I had in them paid off. I'm glad to see that these players continued to grow and that the organization continued to be successful. And then for SK on the other side, it sucks to go to 4-2 after a 3-0 start in the year. 1-2 is certainly not how you wanted to follow up that great first week, but your schedule did get significantly harder. The games that you lost this week weren't exactly the easiest games in the entire world, and I think we just saw some cracks get exposed a little bit, maybe more than they did in week number 1. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Exakick in the bot lane. I really have not been super impressed with Exakick over the course of this split. He was probably the player in week 1 where I was like, he's kind of along for the ride a little bit more. I think generally speaking, AD carries in the LEC have not been particularly strong this split. We'll see if that ends up changing, but, I think DOS has taken a lot of credit, rightfully so, for a lot of the success that bot lane has had early on in the split. Isma created a lot for this bot lane in week number 1. Niski obviously creates a lot of tension. Irrelevant's been winning on the top side. Exakick, I'm not concerned because I still think he's a very good player, and he's been winning these lanes even if he hasn't been the standout, but I'd really like to see him grab this split by the horns. I wanted to see the development where Exakick became the number 1 or number 2 AD carry in the league this year, and it just doesn't seem like that's the direction he's heading. Lucian doesn't necessarily help with that, but would have liked to see a better game here. I think it's also worth noting that everybody else here lost. DOS was not good. Lebrov outplayed him in every aspect. Isma got out-jungled, especially in the early game, by Sheo, and Irrelevant kind of got destroyed by Adam in the top lane. Adam wasn't even playing one of the Gods champions. This is why I was telling people to hold off on the Irrelevant hype. I like him as a player, but he doesn't win every single game, sometimes isolated in a 1v1 if the player he's playing against is just more mechanically talented, which does happen here in the LEC with players like Adam, players like Photon, players like Broken Blade. It's just a little bit more difficult. He's not taking advantage of some weaknesses like he is against some of the other teams. And so, while I do like Irrelevant, I do think this is another example of potentially why you should pump the brakes on some excitement. Nisqy was definitely the positive for this team here. He was winning a lot early on the Tristana. Really great laning phase from him. He just couldn't translate it into anything. Wasn't strong enough, and the rest of the team wasn't able to actually support him in the mid to late game. So overall, again, not a catastrophic loss for SK by any means. Going 4-2 to start this split is still a lot better than I think a lot of people projected them to go. But, you know, for BDS, this is a huge win, and this is really good. They have confirmed themselves in the playoffs. Not that either of these teams are going to miss it. You know, 4 wins probably gets you in guaranteed, but, you know, statistically speaking, BDS is the first team to lock themselves in, and they've earned it. They've looked awesome over the course of this split, specifically here on week number 2. Their only loss being to G2. Pretty good way to start the year. Moving on now to our second game here of the final day in week number 2, and it was Fnatic taking on GIANTX, two teams kind of moving in different directions, and that was shown here with Fnatic being able to pick up yet another victory, moving to 4-2 at the end of the first 2 weeks of action. GIANTX moving to 2-4, again, kind of the polar opposite here, but this is not really a surprise for either of these two teams. Fnatic is a good team. They have things they need to work out. They're certainly not a perfect team, but they're good enough to be able to compete near the top of the standings, which is, you know, which is what their record shows. But for GX, this is a team that is fine. They're probably going to be able to beat the bad teams in the league, but they're not going to be able to beat the best teams in the league that have talent like Fnatic does. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game is going to go to Humanoid in the mid lane. I said it earlier, I'll say it again here. This is probably the best regular season that Humanoid has had in a very long time. It's been a while since we've seen the game-to-game consistency that Humanoid is showing right now in the winter split, and that is massive for Fnatic, because typically speaking, you're waiting on Humanoid to kind of get into form, to kind of get into the Humanoid that we know, so that this team can really start firing on all cylinders. That typically happens in playoffs or in important games, you know, the season finals last year, and so it's really nice to see him be able to pick up things like Hwei that other people in the league just aren't playing at a high level, and actually be able to dominate on it, and be able to control a lot of the team fights, know the champion in and out, and actually, you know, show that he's one of the best mid laners in the entire region. I've been asking him for these performances. I kept saying, if you give me these performances, that I'm going to move you up as the number 1 or 2 mid laner in the LEC, like everybody else tends to say that you are. This is it. Like, this is what I've been waiting on. This is the thing I've been looking for out of Humanoid. It's been awesome to see him be super consistent, but the rest of this team was still good. Oscar Rinnan looked awesome on K'Sante, but for the love of God, can we not give him K'Sante? I mean, truly, it has to be priority number 1 when you're going up against Fnatic to ban or take away K'Sante in that matchup. Oscar looks like a completely different player when he is and isn't on that champion. Hell, he's even good playing into it. I would just ban K'Sante every game going into Fnatic. I don't really see the reason to take the risk or to really even try to play with fate, because it is a stark and drastic difference when this guy is on a champion like that versus when he's not, and I guess I'm just waiting to see someone actually punish him for it. But right now, Oscar looked really good in this game. I'm not going to take that away from him. Razork's been really good. Out-jungled Peach, generated a lot of pressure early and really never gave it up. Great macro control. And Noah and June were along for the ride, as they've kind of been all split long. This has been a jungle mid-focused year for Fnatic, which honestly is great news for Fnatic fans, because you've been waiting for Razork and Humanoid to consistently be on the same page over the past 2 years. This is honestly the best that they've looked as a duo, and that's a really good sign. Now, if the rest of the team can step up and be a bit more consistent, if Oscar can look very good from game to game instead of very good when he gets K'Sante and not so good when he gets everything else, if Noah and June can start winning a lot more isolated in the 2v2, you know, you draft these early game bot lanes like you have been for them all year long. If you can see them kind of dominate these lanes a little bit harder, generate a lot of leads on their own, that would be really nice. But I mean, jungle mid's already in such a good spot. This team is going to be able to compete near the top of the standings. And then for GX, they're just GX. I mean, this is not a surprising result, and the way that they got there isn't particularly surprising. The only thing that's shocking is how bad a couple of these players that I thought were going to be good are in their losses. Like, Jackie's has been solid. Patrick's been fine. You want to see maybe a bit more aggression, maybe a bit more cleanness in the back half of the game, but really the 2 worst players on this team right now are Otoamne and Ignar, and that's really not what you expected to say, I think, going into the year. Otoamne has struggled to go up against basically anybody. He really doesn't seem all that confident right now. This is worse than he looked at at any point last year for Excel, even when that team was in 10th place. He was the one kind of keeping it together for that bad team. It has not been the case in 2024 so far. Obviously, plenty of time to turn it around. It's a very small sample size. 6 games is just not very long. That's barely over a best of 5, but, you know, it's just not been a good demonstration so far. And then for Ignar, he's going to get dead of the game here. Those Ashe arrows were genuinely miserable in the support position. He just didn't have a very good week in terms of clean engages and actually helping his team out, which is, I guess, not a particularly kind way to put it, but he could have been better. I don't think he's the worst player in the world. I think this is just kind of a bump in the road, but Ignar tends to play to the skill level of the team that is around him, and I was worried about that at the beginning of the split because I really wasn't all that high on GX's talent. I think that unfortunately is starting to come out. This team isn't particularly proactive, and so they're leaving a lot on their, you know, AD carry in the support position in Ashe to really create, and that's not good. You have a triple AD carry comp into K'Sante. Like, it can't be on the Ashe to start a lot of these fights, but that's who they're kind of relying on, and Ignar definitely did not step up in this game. GX just looks very uncoordinated. They're going to continue to look like that, I think, against teams that actually know how to take advantage of their weaknesses, but for Fnatic, they're a genuinely good team. They're the kind of team that can take down GX and make it look relatively easy. Nice to see a win here, and especially nice to see Razork and Humanoid looking so good. Moving on to Game 3 here on the final day, and it's a former rivalry in the LEC that has certainly changed in the recent years. It's Mad Lions taking on Rogue, and Mad Lions is going to be able to pick up their 3rd win of the year. They're going to move to 500 after the first 2 weeks of action, and I think generally you'd look at that as a positive if you were a Mad Lions fan. Basically everybody, me included, had them at number 10 to start the year in their power rankings, not because we didn't see the potential of this team. I was huge on Supa and Alvaro, but, you know, I was concerned about players like Merwin and Frescoe and whether or not they were going to be good enough early on. Some of those concerns have been true. Merwin has struggled a bit in better matchups, but, and quite frankly, so have Supa and Alvaro. I'm not trying to say that, you know, my picks have been perfect and the ones that I thought were bad were bad. It's been a mixed bag, but, you know, I think generally Matt has looked a lot better as a unit than people were expecting, and this is another example of that. This is a nice win. It is over Rogue, who is a complete disaster class at the current moment. This team can't win to save their lives, but at the very least, getting to 500 before the just after the midway point of the year for you in the regular season is pretty solid. So let's talk about it. Player of the game. This one was more tough than I think you would expect considering the score lines for a lot of the Mad Lions players, but I'm going to give it to Supa in the bot lane. I thought the Aphelios was probably the most impactful carry in this game, and I think the noticeable difference was him over comp, right? When you're looking at all the lanes and you're looking at who really was able to dominate their lane opponent the most, Supa and Alvaro over comp and Zoalise was the most noticeable, I think, winning lane for Mad in this game, and so Supa is going to get that player of the game for me. Love Supa. I actually think he's been very good in the LEC. He's had his roadblocks and his road bumps over the course of this split, as everybody on this team has, even including Elyoya, quite frankly, but I think for the most part, the talent has very much shown through. Him and Alvaro have really translated that dominant ERL's, you know, Spanish bot lane to the LEC, and it's been quick. I don't know if they're like top 3 or top 4 like I thought was possible at the beginning of the split, but they're certainly like top 6 or somewhere around that area, and I think that's definitely good enough for this team to be relevant. Love Supa's mechanics. I think he's really good at playing aggro, and he's really good at forcing advantages. When he got his lead on Aphelios, and once that Lucian got behind, there was no looking back. He was going to kill that Milio, he was going to kill that Vi over and over and over again until he was so fed that the game ended. Really good stuff from him. Alvaro obviously deserves a lot of mention for the Blitzcrank as well, but it wasn't quite as flashy as when someone like Lebrav was playing it earlier in the week. I think the other player that I want to shout out here is Merwin in the top lane. Some awesome flanks from him on the K'Sante. Great macro coming in from him in this game, and that was a bit of a concern for me. He really didn't show those kinds of instincts in the first couple of games. You know, mechanically speaking, he could be hit or miss in some matchups, but, you know, you wanted to see a bit more out of him when it came to team fighting and split pushing towards the back half of the game. You know, just the overall knowledge of how to play top lane at a high level, at the pro level, and, you know, he was a little bit slow to pick that up, I would say, but in this game, it was actually really good from him, and I think that's a very encouraging sign. Merwin's a very interesting prospect. He was very highly prioritized in the offseason by a couple of teams, including, obviously, Mad, but Heretics as well, and so, you know, obviously, this guy's got a lot of potential. You know, there are a lot of people who see a lot of good things in him. It's good to see the growth over the course of the split. If he can continue to get better, that's going to be real nice. Elyoya's very good at Viego. We already knew that. And Frescoe, he was there. You know, he's kind of been a secondary piece, but he was really good in week number 1, so I don't want to count him out. Mad's just generally pretty solid. I don't think they're a world-breaking team. That's the reason they're top 6 and not like top 4, but, you know, they're top 6. I think they're better than the worst teams in the league, and I think this was another example of that. And then for Rogue, this team just sucks. Even when they try to do things things, it does not work out. Shout out Shigenda. He's been awful all year, and then he finally decided to have a good Aatrox game here. It just didn't matter because his lane opponent was actually better in this one. You know, as good as Shigenda played, Merwin was just doing a lot more, but the rest of this team was completely inept. The bot lane got run over. Lucian does not look good. Lucian Milio is generally a lane that I like, but man, it is not working out. Zoelise is going to get my dead of the game once again here for Rogue. I've been hyping him up as the one player that I think has actually been okay on Rogue, but this was not a very good week number 2. Most of that is stemming to the G2 win, where Zoelise was really good, and the first game of this week, where even though Rogue got kind of blown out, Zoelise was surviving in that game. It has not looked good since then. The last 2 games of week number 2 were really bad from him. He's a rookie. His team sucks. I'm not going to blame him too much. When you play the support position, sometimes you just look worse because you're going for plays that the rest of the team can't follow up on, especially when your team is bad and when your team is losing. But, you know, I at least have to point it out. He was a pretty big non-factor, a negative factor, I should say, for Rogue in this game. And then Marcoon continues to just be miserable on this roster. I like Marcoon a lot. I've liked him over the last few years. I loved him on Excel. I thought he was the best player on that Excel team for a while. Went over to SK and really overperformed expectations last year. Both that team and him individually, I think, overperformed. But man, I don't know if it's just a horrible, horrible team dynamic or if Marcoon is just not the player that he was last year, but he has been really bad to start this split in terms of actually being able to generate any sort of cognizant early game leads. Team fighting has always been his strength as a player, and, you know, relying on his lanes to win has always been something that he has done, but he's never done it to this extent. He's so passive. He's really not making any plays, and the plays that he is making are just bad, and so I don't really know. Larson is super passive. The Twisted Fate did not work out. Like I said, Shigenda was trying to do something, but Merwin, I think, was still better in this game. Rogue is just inept. They might be the worst team in the league. You know, we've talked about Corp definitively being number 10. They still have another game here. They could potentially tie up the record, and can you really make the argument that Corp has definitely looked worse than Rogue? I certainly think it's a conversation. At least Rogue beat G2, but at the end of the day, this is an awful, awful team, one that absolutely deserves to be in the bottom 2 right now. And Mad deserves to be in the top 6. I think there is a clear top 6, bottom 4 right now in the LEC, and Mad is kind of on the cusp of that, right? They're in that top 6. I think you could call it a top 5 and a bottom 4 with Mad like clearly in the middle. I think that's probably a bit more accurate, but it's still better than the bottom teams in the league, and that's all you really need to be. 3 wins is a pretty good place to be. Going into the final week of the season, you probably only need 3 to get into playoffs here. A 4th will almost certainly guarantee it. So for Mad, with all of these rookies and Elyoya in their first split, it's really nice to see them, you know, with an opportunity to actually perform in some best of 3s and best of 5s. Then moving on to game 4 here of the final day, and what a game. I mean, truly, this is another one of those big upsets that tends to happen. I wonder why it's always the same team that loses it. It's Team Vitality taking on G2 Esports, and Vitality slaughtered them. I mean, this was not a close game. I want to make that abundantly clear. This was not just a close game. You know, G2 made a couple of mistakes, but they couldn't come back. This was Vitality being ridiculously clean, and G2 really not having a chance after the first, like, 5 to 6 minutes of the game. This was awesome from Vitality. Really, really great stuff from them. Obviously, I want to sit here and complain about G2, but they drafted a comp, I say, in quotations. They drafted something for them to play here, but Vitality just had a very well-rounded draft, and they had a lot of tools to be able to play through, and they went out and they just outplayed G2, and they kind of dominated and destroyed them in this game. This is a 3-0 week for Vitality. They went 0-3 to start. They're 3-3. They're 500 now moving into the final week of the season. That's pretty darn good. I know half of this week was spent beating Rogue and Corp, and so you can't really freak out too much, but G2 is really not a bad way to cap off a 3-0 week, in my opinion, so let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game, gonna go to Hylissang in the support position. Awesome Senna game. What a ridiculous sentence that I just said there. Hylissang just looked amazing against G2, who's the best team in the league on Senna. Very weird combination of words that I've put together here. Senna does not feel like the champion that would fall into Hylissang's playstyle, where he would excel on it, but this was really awesome. I mean, he was very oppressive in lane. You know, Seraphine Sona really wants to scale into that team fight stage. That's really where they're gonna start to take over. They're gonna become very difficult to kill, and they're gonna make Tristana and Yone and Vi very difficult to deal with in that same vein. But if you just like beat them early, if Neela just gets super far ahead, and if the Senna is just constantly poking them down and Sona has to run out of mana every 4 seconds in order to survive the laning phase, well, all of a sudden the game becomes infinitely easier now, doesn't it? So really good stuff from Hylissang. Really happy to see him show up so big in this game, and He's received a lot of criticism, for last year, and I think for the beginning of this year. I think half of that is worth it. I think at the beginning of this year, he was really bad, but he was awesome in this game, and Vitality's starting to get their mojo back, and Hylissang could be a really big contributor for this team if they continue to grow like that. I thought Douglas had a really nice game on the Maokai. Photon looked really good on the Cassante, just a champion that continues to look incredibly busted in the West in particular, but it looks busted in the East too. It's not just, Western players don't know how to play against Cassante. That champion is just in a ridiculous state. Obviously, he's not broken in the same way that we've seen broken champions in the past, but the champion is inherently broken, so it just ends up being a bit of a problem. VTO was solid, was the big carry on this team earlier in the week in both of their games, still looked good on the Corki here, just didn't really have to do a whole ton, and Karzi definitely capitalized on a lot of the things Hylissang created here with the Nila, which I really do like as an answer to some of these more passive bot lanes in the early game, like what G2 drafted in this one. Vitality honestly just got a small advantage, and they took it and ran with it as far as they could run with it, so really good to see them do that. But for G2 on the other end, no good, man. This is not a good game, and it's 2 weeks in a row now where the final game of the week, you just look completely inept against a bad team, or a team that most people consider to be relatively poor. I know that's kind of the G2 way, but I would have liked to see this team be a little bit more consistent at this point. There are genuine concerns that I have. Broken Blade continues to not look like a star up on the top side of the map, and while Caps is looking good and he was able to do a couple of things on Tristana here, Yike reverted back to some negatives that we've seen from him in the past, got out jungled by Douglas, even on a champion that should have more prio in the early game. And then the bot lane just continues to not be very good. Mickey X is going to get dud of the game here. He's been the one that's kind of been holding the bot lane together, but the Sona just didn't exist. Like I said, what ended up happening in this is that there was so much damage coming out from Vitality's 2v2 that Sona was ending up basically on repeat and just losing lane because of it. It was really good stuff from Vitality, but Mickey had absolutely no effect on the game. He was so squishy, he died in an instant, and he really didn't contribute all that much in order for a lot of the plays that they made to go off. It just wasn't very good. From Mickey and from G2, Hansama continued to look completely useless, this time on the Seraphine. Get this guy on Draven, get him on Callista. If he's not on that, it's a problem. I know he's looked okay in some other matchups. The Varus on the second day here was relatively good, but I am worried about Hansama. Genuinely, I am worried about Hansama. I'm not pulling the trigger on him just yet as a bad player, but he's got a lot to prove to me. This bot lane got destroyed in this game, and Broken Blade also has a lot to prove to me. So G2 maybe not as unflappable as we all predicted they would be going into the year, but they're still G2. Do I think I'm going to move them down from number 1? I don't know. I don't think so, but I'll have to think about that before, the end of the video. But this is a really nice win for Vitality. We all kind of counted them out after the first week, but they rebounded incredibly nicely. That's what happens when you have a super veteran coach like Mac and a really nice support system surrounding some volatile players. You're going to have your bad weeks, but it's all about how you respond to your bad weeks, not about how those bad weeks end up going. So really nice to see Vitality fight back and get that 3-0 this week. Even if not every game looked great, this was a fantastic way to end week number 2. And now we get to move on to our final game of the week here, and it was a good one? I don't really know how to describe it. It was Team Heretics taking on Corp, and Heretics is going to be picking up their 4th win of the season. So many teams sitting at 4 wins, only one team sitting at 5 wins, and only one team sitting at 0 wins. That being KC. It is about as bad as it could possibly get. An 0-6 start to the LEC tenure. 0-3 in week 1, 0-3 in week 2. Not really what you were looking for, and again, there just really aren't a ton of signs that it's going to get better for KC. Even if they are able to pick up a win next week against a really bad rogue team, I don't really see a lot of reasons to believe that they can get any more than that and actually get into one of these tiebreakers. Their schedule is not easy next week outside of that rogue game. It's actually very difficult, so unfortunate for them, but Heretics with a really nice win here. They continue to look like one of the better teams in the LEC. Unable to overcome G2 at the moment, but still a really solid and really consistent team that I think is going to be very scary to face in a best of 5. So let's talk about it. Player of the game, it's going to go to Flackid on his Draven in this game. Really nice stuff coming out from him. You really like to see him be super aggro into another AD carry that just really struggles with the champion that he's on. It's almost a meme at this point, Upset and his guns. I don't really know how to describe it. We'll talk about it when we get to the KC section, but Flackid really took advantage of that in the laning phase where he was just constantly creating a lot of pressure. But man, that team fighting out of Draven, really good. good. His positioning was really, really good in this game, and he was showing glimpses of this last year in 2023 in the summer split. That's really, the best year I would say that he had. Even back on G2, he was never really given a lot of the resources, but, that week one when he came back in summer of last year was so phenomenal, and it really probably earned him a spot back on this team, so it's nice to see him continue to play really aggressive picks like the Draven and continue to look really good on them, continue to prove that he deserves to be on one of the better teams in the LEC. Him and Kaiser actually have very good synergy together. I think this bot lane has secretly been one of the best in the entire league. I shouldn't say secretly, because it's not like this team is known as a bad team or anything, but I don't think people expected these two to click as well as they've clicked. Like, they've worked really well together. I think the aggroness of Kaiser and Flacket's willingness to play whatever role is asked of him, I think have really meshed well together. And they've created a duo that's very difficult to deal with, so good from both of them. Jankos in general had a very good week, this time on the Jarvan in this game in particular. Out-jungled Bo. You're going to see a lot of people say that Bo was like hanging on by a thread in this game, and I agree. Again, Bo does a lot of damage, and he does so much in these team fights, but he also has like one or two plays in this game where it's like, why are you there? What exactly are you hoping to accomplish by being there as Lilia, one of your team's primary damage dealers in this specific instance? Bo just has those moments, but Jankos looked really good in this one. Perks was solid on the Azir. A big takeaway, no real Perks mistakes coming out so far this season. I mean, he's had games where it's like, you could have played that a little bit better, especially that Mad Lions one, but for the most part, it's like, okay, this guy is actually just really good again, and oops, who could have seen that coming? I mean, I've been hyping up Perks for a little while, but he had obviously been playing better than the results that he had been getting. Really nice to see the process back up the results in this case. And then for Wunder, he was good on the top side. Had to, got to play into Cabashard, I should say, who's just been atrocious at this level, but still, Wunder looked good. So overall, nice game for Heretics. And then, I've already talked about K-Corp a little bit here. Upset's gonna get done of the game. I've never seen anyone play Aphelios and just not understand how to do the gun rotation at a pro level more than Upset. I don't know if he's just never taken the time to learn it or if he thinks he's got a better version of it, but it doesn't work, man. The guy doesn't do any damage. And, I tweeted out during this game, Upset's not playing well, and I agree with that. He gets done of the game for a reason. Upset wasn't playing well, but it is actually laughable, and this just goes for the entire split, how frustrated I would be if I was the AD carry for K-Corp, because Upset is constantly just left in situations where the rest of his team abandons him, and it's like, hey man, I'm playing Aphelios. I'm the one who has to carry this game from behind in this situation. Don't just leave me to die in the back of the Baron pit. Why is my Lulu walking away from me in a team fight and just leaving me to die? Like, what is going on? I can't possibly understand what was going through the head of Targamas. He has been miserably bad. Seiken, I think, looked better this week than he did in week one, but that's really not saying all that much. Bo just continues to be whatever in the jungle. He's okay, he's doing things, but like, he's not winning games, obviously. And then, Cabashard is the worst top laner in the league. Like, this team just looks completely inept at this level. Their players don't look like they can play at this level, and that's why I'm concerned that even though they play a team like Rogue, who has looked super bad next week, I don't even know if they're going to win that game, and that certainly says something. Casey's had opportunities after opportunities to get better over the course of the beginning of this split, even play bad teams already, and it's just not come true. If they aren't able to pick up that win against Rogue, I think it will be a pretty quick 0-9, and I really would be shocked if this team won more than one game this split. I feel pretty confident that this is going to be a bottom two team, and that's a pretty sad thing to say about our new face in the league. But for Heretics, nice win. This still is one of the best teams in the league. 4-2 is a big cluster right now, but I think in terms of how they've gotten there, they look pretty darn good doing it. Their only loss outside of G2 was that demolition to Mad Lions early on in the split, but since then, they've looked really calm, cool, and collected, and that's exactly what you want to see out of a veteran team with a lot of veteran players. Really like what Heretics is looking like, and I think this is still a team that should be considered a favorite to get to the finals, if not win everything, if everything goes right. All right, but that is going to do it for week number 2 of the LEC Winter Split here in 2024. I really do hope you guys enjoyed. We cover all 15 games across all 3 days. Up on the screen now is going to be the updated standings. Of course, any ties will just be broken alphabetically. There are still quite a lot of ties because that's just how the LEC goes. Not enough games to really break a ton of ties at this point, but we do have our first team that has officially qualified for top 8, locked themselves in no matter what. That is Team BDS with 5 wins, going 5-1, alone in first place. But let's go ahead and talk about what you see. Of course, all these teams are ordered in standings order, but in the first column to the right of the team name, you're going to see my personal power ranking of that team after this week. In the second column, you're going to see how that has changed from last week to this week, so we can go over the risers and the fallers right now. Risers, the important ones at the very least. First of all, G2 and Heretics staying at top 2. I think right now, I still believe in these two as the two best teams in the league. Heretics and BDS play at the beginning of next week, the beginning of week number 3. That's going to be a very telling game for both of these teams because BDS does move up to number 3 in my power rankings, I think. Obviously, depending on what happens in that game, BDS could take that number 2 spot. And honestly, G2's not like safe at number 1. They certainly have not looked as clinical as I would have liked. Certainly not as perfect as I would have liked. But for now, that's my top 3. Fnatic falls to 4 and SK falls to 5 because of BDS rising up. And then Mad staying at 6, but jumping up to number 7, jumping up 2 spots. It's going to be Vitality going from number 9 to number 7. 3-0 week looked really good, but it was against pretty weak competition outside of G2. If they can run it back next week and continue to look really good, if VTO and Hylissang continue to look very aggressive and, play well together, Photon has another good week, which I expect, then Vitality could make the top 6. They were honestly better than Mad Lions this week, and so it's going to be interesting to see, but that means GIANTX falls down to number 8, and Rogue falls down to number 9. Rogue and K-Corp definitely rounding out the bottom of the list, and GIANTX really not being all that inspiring in the middle here. So those are my power rankings. Let me know what you agree with, what you disagree with down in the comments, but let's move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week. Player of the week here for week number 2, no surprise, it's going to go to Lebrov in the support position. He just was the best player in the LEC this week. He dominated on all 3 games of Blitzcrank. A really, really good showing from a player that we've really been waiting to see kind of break out, not only as a good player, because he was a good, above average, borderline great player last year. This was a great player performance over the course of this week. If he can keep that up and potentially be the best support in the LEC, that's going to be awesome for BDS. His teammate Adam is one of the honorable mentions. BDS in general was super dominant over the course of this week. That included Adam winning basically every laning phase that he was in. And the other honorable mention going to VTO, the mid laner for Vitality. That was a really good week overall for Vitality, and even in the game they struggled in, VTO looked awesome. He finally got to play some high mobility assassins and then, kind of a boring quirky game to end out the week, but generally VTO was very dominant. And then dud of the week, this one also not probably a huge surprise to people. It's going to go to Targamas, the support for K-Corp. This team is a disaster, but Targamas in particular looks incredibly outmatched at this level. He was awful in week 1. He was even worse in week number 2. There was nobody else that I was really considering for this. I think theoretically you could put a player like Merwin maybe in this circumstance, maybe even someone like Zoelis or Marcoon on Rogue. They all had really bad weeks, but Targamas was a pretty easy choice for me. It felt like his individual performances were the most noticeably bad, and that was worth calling out here as my dud of the week. I've liked Targamas a lot in the past. I've even rated him as my number 1 support in the past. I just don't think he's anywhere close to that. Right now, he's like the number 13 support, and there's only 10 players in the league, and that's not a good sign. So Targamas getting dud of the week, Lebrov getting player of the week, but that is going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only cover the LEC on this channel, we cover all 4 of the major regions as well as the NACL every single week on this channel. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of basically everything going on in LoL esports, especially, with MSI potentially being something that you want to tune into, this is a good channel to get all that news and information. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.